Alice woke to the soft rays of sunlight creeping through the curtains, painting golden streaks on the walls of her bedroom. She stretched lazily, catching a whiff of the freshly brewed coffee waiting for her in the kitchen. James loved these quiet morning routines, making her favorite pancakes and setting the table just the way she liked. 5 years of blissful marriage had felt like living inside a safe, picturesque bubble where nothing could ever go wrong. But that day was different. While reorganizing their shared closet, she stumbled upon a pile of old books and papers tucked behind a box of James's university memorabilia. Among them was a plain, slightly wrinkled envelope that seemed out of place. Curious, she picked it up. It felt weighty, almost ominous in her hands. She glanced around as though expecting someone to stop her before carefully pulling out its contents. What she found made her breath hitch. A collection of photographs spilled out. Pictures of James, looking much younger, arm in arm with a beautiful brunette. Their faces radiated joy and intimacy that Alice had only ever associated with the two of them. But these weren't ordinary snapshots. Several were unmistakably taken during a wedding ceremony. The groom was James, and the bride, well, it wasn't Alice. Her world tilted. Her stomach knotted painfully as she sifted through each photo, hoping against hope that this was some elaborate mistake. Maybe it was from a film set James had worked on in his brief stint as a photographer. Maybe it was some kind of practical joke. But no, the emotions etched in those captured moments felt too real. The perfection of their morning routine felt distant now, like a warm mirage shattered by this discovery. Every image mocked the life she believed in, the love she'd thought was untouchable. By the time James returned home that evening, Alice had been sitting at the kitchen table for hours, the envelope and its incriminating contents laid out before her. The sight of her hunched posture, shoulders tense, instantly drained the color from his face. "What's this, James?" Her voice was controlled, but thinly veiled pain edged every word. She gestured to the photos spread across the table. "Who is she?" For a fleeting moment, he seemed at a loss. His mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish gasping out of water. His silence betrayed more than words ever could. "It's not what you think," he finally said, his voice shaky. He sat down across from her, but Alice didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on him, daring him to come up with a plausible explanation. "This was before us. It's ancient history, Alice. It doesn't matter now." But it mattered to her. His words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to throw dirt over the surface of an exposed wound without bothering to treat it. "Ancient history," she repeated, her tone growing colder. "You've had 5 years to mention this so-called ancient history to me. Did you think I'd never find out?" James ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit she had once found endearing. Now, it seemed like a tell, proof that he was grasping for something to cling to in the face of her unrelenting gaze. "I didn't know how to bring it up, Alice," he muttered. "It ended a long time ago. She's gone. Gone." Alice's voice cracked slightly. "What does that even mean? Dead? Out of your life? You've lied to me every day we've been together, James." "I didn't lie," he countered quickly. Too quickly. Look, this was a mistake. I should have told you. But it didn't seem relevant anymore. "I swear, Alice, you're the only one I love." But her faith in his words had already shattered. His frantic explanations did nothing to quench the burning questions in her mind. Why keep the photos? Why preserve memories of something you'd buried so deeply you never spoke of it? She wanted to believe him, but that naive part of her heart had already fractured under the weight of this unexpected revelation. Their argument spilled into the late hours, volleys of accusations and weak justifications tearing into the fragile seams of their idyllic life. Eventually, James retreated to the couch, leaving Alice alone in their bedroom, surrounded by silence and questions. She barely slept that night. As dawn crept into the sky, Alice resolved one thing. If James couldn't tell the truth, she would have to find it herself. Alice spent the rest of the day in a haze. She tried distracting herself with cleaning, making calls, even scrolling through her phone mindlessly. But none of it worked. Her mind was fixed on the photos. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of James, smiling beside the mysterious woman, invaded her thoughts. When James finally came home that evening, humming a tune and carrying takeout, she was waiting. The photos were laid neatly on the dining table, like evidence presented before a jury. "James," she began, her voice trembling but firm. "What is this?" She pointed at the pictures. His smile faltered. The bags in his hands hit the floor with a muted thud. But he didn't seem to notice. All the warmth drained from his expression, replaced by a mix of shock and panic. "Where did you?" He stopped himself, running a hand over his face. He sat down across from her, but didn't touch the photos. "Alice, it's not what it looks like." "That's funny," she said, crossing her arms. "Because it looks a hell of a lot like you married someone else before me." "It's not that simple," he replied quickly. Too quickly. Alice felt her stomach knot at the sight of his nervousness. He avoided her gaze, and his fingers fidgeted against the edge of the table. James, her composed and caring husband, looked like a cornered animal. "Then make it simple," she pressed, her tone sharp. "Who is she? Why do you still have these photos? Why didn't you ever tell me?" He sighed deeply, running both hands through his hair, a habit she'd come to associate with his stress. "Her name was Claire," he began, voice low. "This was before us, Alice. Long before. She was someone I loved, but it's over. It's been over for years." "Over," Alice echoed, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "James, you didn't just forget to mention an ex-girlfriend. You failed to mention a wife." His eyes widened. No, it wasn't like that. We weren't married, not really. It was complicated. I didn't bring it up because I didn't think it mattered anymore. I didn't want it to matter." Alice could feel her trust cracking under the weight of his vague explanations. She wasn't getting the answers she needed, only more questions. "If it didn't matter," she said slowly, "then why keep these? Why not get rid of them?" There was no reply. "I thought I had," he finally whispered, barely audible. His face looked haunted now, as if dredging up these memories had pulled something darker to the surface. "I didn't even remember they were still here." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Alice studied his face, searching for some sign that this could be salvaged, that he was telling her the truth. But all she saw was guilt and fear. She rose from the table, picking up the photos and sliding them back into the envelope. "James," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "I need to think, and you need to decide whether you're going to tell me the whole truth, or if I'll have to find it myself." Without another word, she turned and left the room, leaving him sitting there, staring at the empty table. The morning felt heavier than usual. Alice barely touched her breakfast, her appetite buried under the weight of her thoughts. James had left early for work, and the house was quiet, too quiet. It gave her too much time to think about the photos and the countless unanswered questions. She sat at the kitchen table, spreading the pictures in front of her like puzzle pieces. Her eyes wandered over every detail. On one of the photographs, she noticed the facade of a building behind James and the unknown woman. The sign above read, "Riverside Inn." It wasn't a place she'd heard James mention before. Grabbing her laptop, Alice typed Riverside Inn into the search bar. Several locations popped up, but only one matched the image on the photo. A quaint, old-fashioned hotel about 2 hours away. Her heart raced. Could this lead her to the truth? As she stared at the search results, she weighed her options. Should she confront James again, or take matters into her own hands? A wave of determination surged through her. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Alice reached out to a friend, Carol, who had known James for years. "Hey, Alice. Long time no talk," Carol greeted cheerfully over the phone. "Hi, Carol," Alice replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to ask you something. Did James ever mention being married? Before me, I mean." The question hung in the air for a moment before Carol responded, her tone curious, but cautious. "Married? No, that doesn't sound like him. Why are you asking? Did something happen?" "Nothing," Alice lied. "Just a silly thought. Thanks anyway." As she hung up, her chest felt tight. Even Carol, who had known James since university, had no clue about his past. If this was such a big part of his life, why had he kept it hidden for so long? Determined not to be deterred, Alice decided to visit the riverside in herself. She packed a small bag, grabbed the envelope of photos, and set off. The drive was uneventful, but her mind buzzed with possibilities. When she arrived, the hotel was just as it had looked in the photograph. A charming yet slightly run-down building with peeling white paint and flower boxes on the windowsills. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of wood polish and fresh linens. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up from her desk. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked warmly. Alice hesitated, then pulled out one of the photos from the envelope. "Hi, do you recognize this place? Or this couple?" The receptionist's smile faded slightly as she studied the photograph. She tapped her finger on the counter, lost in thought. "Oh, yes," she said finally. "That wedding, it was years ago. Maybe a decade. One of the first events we hosted here. I remember them. They were such a lovely couple. Is this about them? Did something happen?" Alice's heart skipped a beat. The receptionist was confirming it. James had been here, with another woman, for what looked like a wedding. "Do you remember their names?" Alice pressed, her voice shaking. "I think his name was James," the receptionist said, her brows furrowing as she tried to recall. Alice felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. She muttered a quick thank you and left before the woman could ask any more questions. Sitting in her car outside the inn, Alice clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The truth was closer than ever, but with every piece she uncovered, it felt as if James had built his entire life with her on a lie. When she returned home that evening, James was already there, watching TV in the living room as if nothing had happened. "Alice," he called out with his usual warmth. "How was your day?" She stared at him, her chest tight with anger and hurt. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, he's going to explain everything, or I will find someone who will. Alice's mind was clouded with doubts as she walked into the living room that night. James sat on the couch, casually flipping through TV channels. His carefree demeanor sparked a fresh wave of anger in her chest. How could he pretend everything was normal when their entire life felt like a lie? "James, we need to talk," she said firmly, standing in front of the TV. He paused, glancing at her before setting the remote down. "All right," he said cautiously, sitting up straighter. "What's on your mind?" Alice crossed her arms, gripping the envelope of photos tightly. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I went to the riverside inn today. I talked to someone who remembers you. And her." James' face paled, his lips parted as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. "They said it was a wedding," Alice continued, her voice rising with frustration. "And they mentioned your name. So, James, please tell me, what kind of man am I married to?" For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed deeply, rubbing his face with both hands. "Alice, it's not what you think," he started. "Oh, really? Then please explain it to me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for 5 years. James stood and started pacing the room. "Her name was Sophie," he admitted, his voice soft. "And yes, we were married. But it was years ago, long before I met you." Alice stared at him in disbelief. "You were married? How could you not tell me?" "I wanted to, but it's complicated," he said, his eyes pleading. "Sophie and I weren't together long. Things fell apart quickly." "That doesn't explain why you kept it a secret," Alice snapped. James hesitated, then finally sat back down, his shoulders slumped. "Sophie and I got married when we were young and stupid. We thought we were in love, but it was more of a toxic, unhealthy relationship. She had her secrets, and I had mine. When it ended, it was ugly." He looked up at Alice, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. "She disappeared shortly after our divorce. I don't even know what happened to her. Those photos are all I have left, reminder of a chapter of my life I wanted to forget. That's why I never told you. It doesn't matter anymore. It hasn't mattered for a long time." Alice shook her head, trying to process everything. "If it didn't matter, why keep the photos? Why not tell me when we got married?" "I was ashamed," James admitted, "and scared. I didn't want to lose you over something that happened so long ago. Alice stared at him, her emotions swirling in chaos. His explanation sounded plausible, but something about it didn't sit right. There were still too many unanswered questions, and her gut told her this wasn't the full story. "James, do you swear you're telling me everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough to shatter her remaining trust. "Get out," Alice said suddenly, her voice breaking. James froze. "What?" "Get out of the house," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this right now. I need time to think." "Alice, please," he began, stepping closer to her, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Leave," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Reluctantly, James grabbed his jacket and left, leaving Alice alone in the now empty house. As the door clicked shut, she sank onto the couch, clutching the photos in her hands. She knew James was hiding more, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The silence of the empty house pressed down on Alice as she sat in the dimly lit living room. James was gone, leaving her alone with the chaos he had unleashed. She couldn't trust his explanation. Something about the way he hesitated, the way his eyes darted when pressed for details, it all screamed deceit. Alice knew she couldn't simply let this go. The photos, the lies, the fragments of a story that didn't quite add up, they demanded answers. And if James wasn't going to provide them, she'd have to find them herself. The next morning, Alice reached out to a private investigator. His name was Eric Miller, a grizzled man in his early 50s with a reputation for digging up the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. "So," Eric said, leaning back in his chair as Alice slid the envelope of photos across the desk. "What exactly are we looking for here?" "I want to know everything," Alice said firmly. "Who she is, what their connection was, and why he's been hiding it from me." Eric nodded, flipping through the pictures with a practiced eye. "I'll need a few days, maybe longer, depending on how deep this rabbit hole goes." As Alice left his office, a mix of dread and anticipation churned in her gut. What if she discovered something even worse than she'd imagined? 3 days later, Eric called with updates. "I've got something for you," he said over the phone. "You might want to come down to my office for this." Alice's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel on her way there. When she arrived, Eric handed her a folder filled with documents, notes, and a few more photos. "The woman in your pictures is Sophie Grant," Eric began. "She was married to James about 10 years ago. The two of them had what looked like a whirlwind romance, but it didn't end well." Alice stared at Sophie's face in one of the photographs, feeling an odd mix of jealousy and pity. "What happened?" she asked. "Sophie disappeared," Eric said flatly. "There was no foul play officially recorded, but friends of hers filed missing person reports. They said she and James had a lot of arguments, and some suspected she might have run off. Others thought." He trailed off, giving Alice a meaningful look. "You're saying James might have had something to do with it?" "I'm not saying that," Eric corrected, "but his name comes up a lot when you dig into the case." Alice's chest tightened. This wasn't just about a hidden marriage. It was a potential crime. Back at home, Alice paced the living room, the folder of evidence sitting on the coffee table like a bomb waiting to detonate. What was she supposed to do now? Call the police? Confront James? Pretend none of this was real? When James called that evening, his voice was soft and apologetic. "Alice, can we talk? Please. I miss you. You miss me." Alice spat into the phone. "How about Sophie? Do you miss her too?" James was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I take it you've been digging." "I had to," she said coldly, "because you're incapable of telling me the truth." "Then you know that I didn't have anything to do with her disappearance," James said, his voice tinged with desperation. "It was a disaster of a relationship, but I'm not a monster." Alice laughed bitterly. "That's convenient to say now, isn't it? But why should I believe anything you tell me? You've been lying to me for years." There was another long pause. Then, James said something that sent a chill down Alice's spine. "If you keep going down this road, you're going to find things you wish you hadn't." Before she could respond, he hung up, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet of their shattered life. Alice couldn't sleep. James's cryptic warning played over and over in her head. You're going to find things you wish you hadn't. He wasn't wrong. Each new piece of information felt like a step closer to the edge of a cliff. But she couldn't stop. The truth was no longer just a need. It was an obsession. The next morning, Eric called again. His voice was serious. Alice, we need to meet. I found more, and it's disturbing. 15 minutes later, Alice was back in Eric's cramped office, her heart pounding. He didn't waste any time. I kept digging into Sophie's disappearance, Eric began. Turns out, she wasn't the first person tied to James who went missing under strange circumstances. What do you mean? Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric slid another folder across the desk. Before Sophie, there was another woman. Her name was Melissa Kane. She dated James briefly in college. She went missing too, never found. There was no solid evidence linking him to her disappearance. But he was one of the last people seen with her. Alice stared at the photograph of Melissa, a vibrant young woman with bright green eyes and a carefree smile. It felt like a gut punch. Are you saying he's responsible? I'm not making accusations, Eric replied carefully. But two disappearances connected to one man. That's a hell of a coincidence. Alice's mind raced. Two missing women, both connected to James. And now she was here, his wife, unwittingly tangled in whatever dark web he'd been weaving. Eric leaned forward, tapping one of the documents in the folder. There's something else. I found an old police report from when Sophie disappeared. It mentioned a cabin James owned upstate. It was never searched because there was no warrant, and at the time, there wasn't enough cause. But I found records that show he still owns it. A cabin? Alice echoed, her stomach churning. Yes, it's remote, barely on the map. If there's anything he's hiding, that's where it might be. Alice's instinct screamed at her to leave this alone, but she couldn't. If there was a chance to uncover the truth, she had to take it. Can you get me the address? She asked. Eric hesitated. Are you sure about this? I don't know what you'll find, and you'll be going in blind. I have to know, Alice said firmly. Whatever it is, I can't live like this anymore. Armed with the address and a newfound resolve, Alice set out the next morning. She told herself it was just a trip to satisfy her curiosity. But deep down, she feared what she might uncover. The drive was long and winding, taking her away from the bustling city and into dense, silent forests. As the road narrowed, she felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her. The cabin wasn't marked by any signs or visible landmarks. She only knew she'd arrived because her GPS announced the destination. It was a small, weathered structure, partially hidden by overgrown trees. The windows were covered with grime, and the wooden porch creaked ominously as Alice stepped onto it. She hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before gathering her courage and pushing it open. The inside smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It didn't look like anyone had been there in ages, but as Alice explored, she found subtle signs of recent activity. A discarded coffee cup, footprints in the dust, and a pile of firewood near the stove. She searched every room, opening cabinets and drawers, but found nothing significant. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she noticed a trapdoor hidden under a rug in the bedroom. Her heart raced as she pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. Armed with her phone's flashlight, Alice descended the creaking steps. The basement was cold and damp, with stone walls that made her feel like she'd stepped back in time. At first, it seemed empty, but then she saw it, a locked trunk sitting in the corner. Her hands trembled as she fiddled with the lock. It didn't take much effort. The rusty metal gave way easily. She opened the trunk, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside were items that seemed to span decades. Letters, photographs, and personal belongings. Among them were a bracelet with the initials MK, and a wedding ring engraved with the words Forever, SG. Melissa Kane. Sophie Grant. Alice sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. This wasn't just evidence, it was a collection. A trophy chest. And then she heard it. the unmistakable crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching through the leaves and gravel outside the cabin. Her body went cold. She scrambled to close the trunk and hide any sign of her discovery, but her hands trembled too much. She managed to push it back against the wall, just as the front door creaked open upstairs. "Alice." James's voice called, smooth but laced with suspicion. "I know you're here." Her breath hitched. She glanced around for something, anything, to defend herself. A rusty crowbar leaned against the wall, and she grabbed it, gripping the cold metal tightly. James's steps echoed above her, deliberate and slow, as though he was savoring the moment. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "I warned you." Alice didn't respond. Instead, she backed herself into the shadows, crouching behind a pillar near the trunk. Her mind raced with every worst-case scenario. What would he do if he found her? Did he already suspect what she had uncovered? The footsteps moved closer. The creak of the basement stairs cut through the silence like a blade. Alice tried to steady her breathing, but each inhale felt louder than the last. James reached the bottom of the stairs, his figure barely visible in the faint glow from Alice's phone, which she had left on the ground. He bent down, picking up the phone, his face illuminated for a split second, a flash of anger, disappointment, and something darker. "Looking for answers?" he asked, turning his head slowly, scanning the room. "It's funny. I thought we had trust between us, Alice. Guess I was wrong." Alice couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped out from her hiding spot, the crowbar held firmly in her hands. "Trust," she spat, her voice shaking. "Was I supposed to trust you after finding a hidden past, 2 missing women, and whatever the hell this is?" James's expression darkened. "You don't understand. You've been looking at this all wrong." "Oh, really? Then explain," Alice shouted, her frustration and fear boiling over. "Explain why you have a trunk full of mementos from women who are dead or missing. Explain why you lied to me for 5 years. Explain why I married a stranger." James took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Alice, listen to me. Melissa and Sophie, they were part of something bigger. Something you don't want to be involved in." Alice narrowed her eyes, her grip on the crowbar tightening. "Don't you dare twist this. This isn't about some bigger picture. It's about you and whatever sick secrets you've been hiding." James's mask of calm cracked, and his voice rose. "You don't know what I've done to protect you. You think this is simple, but it's not. Those women, they weren't innocent. And if I hadn't done what I did, we wouldn't even be standing here right now." Alice's stomach turned. "Protect me? Don't spin this into some noble sacrifice. You've lied, manipulated, and buried the truth. Who are you?" James took another step forward, and Alice instinctively raised the crowbar. "Stay back," she warned, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room was heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, James let out a bitter laugh. "You want the truth? Fine. I was trying to start over, Alice. You were my fresh start, my chance to leave it all behind. But you just couldn't let it go." Alice's anger flared. "Leave what behind? Manipulation? You don't just start over from ruining lives." He shook his head, his eyes cold and calculating now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Alice realized then that James had no intention of letting her leave the cabin alive. Her survival instincts kicked in. "Harder," she said, buying time. "You think cleaning up this mess is my fault?" She lunged forward, swinging the crowbar with all her strength. James was caught off guard, stumbling back as the blow struck his arm. He shouted in pain, but his shot gave Alice a crucial advantage. She didn't stop to think. She just ran, darting up the basement stairs. She bolted for the door, slamming it behind her and running into the dense forest. The cool night air burned her lungs as she ran, branches scratching at her skin. Behind her, she could hear James calling out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Alice, you can't outrun this. You can't outrun me." Alice didn't stop until she reached her car. Fumbling with her keys, she unlocked the door and jumped in, slamming it shut just as James appeared at the edge of the forest. Their eyes met through the windshield, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. James started toward the car, but Alice floored the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as she could. Her heart pounded as she put as much distance between herself and the cabin as possible. She didn't stop driving until she reached the city. Only then did she pull over, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The police took her story seriously, but without concrete evidence tying James to the disappearances, they couldn't issue an immediate warrant. Alice handed over the photos and items from the trunk, hoping it would be enough. As days turned into weeks, Alice tried to rebuild her life. She changed the locks, installed cameras, and kept her phone within arm's reach. But deep down, she knew James wasn't done with her. One night, a package arrived on her doorstep. Inside was a single photograph of her, taken recently, with the words, "You should have listened." Alice stared at it, a chill running down her spine. She knew this wasn't over. But one thing was certain. She wasn't the same woman she had been. She was ready to fight for her freedom, no matter the cost. And somewhere in the darkness, James was watching, waiting for his next move.
Thank you very much for watching. Did you like this story? Like, subscribe, and write a comment about your opinion.